Welcome to the Compact Podcast. I'm Jeff Schellenberger in for Matthew Schmitz this week, and I'm joined by Nina Power and Saurabh Murray. Today we'll be discussing the state of politics in the UK, notably the return of former Prime Minister David Cameron to prominence, as well as other developments, and the continued dysfunctionality of the US Congress, and particularly its conservative faction. And finally, the conversion to Christianity of former New-Atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. To begin, I will turn things over to Nina. David Cameron was Prime Minister, called the Brexit referendum, then after campaigning for the Remain side, lost and promptly resigned, seeming to mark the end of his political career after occupying quite a dominant position, has now been brought back from the dead. And, like some kind of revenant, is sort of Michael Myers in the latest Halloween, is once again seemingly inescapable and unkillable. What's going on with David Cameron's return, and what does it tell us about the current state of politics in the UK?
We had an excellent piece by Peter Hitchens that was quite excoriating about Cameron. I think there are lots of things going on. Perhaps in more general terms, we can talk about a kind of complete collapse of the elites, but their nevertheless zombie persistence. I think the return of Cameron, above all, indicates that there is really no difference between left and right. That Britain is governed forever by a uniparty of indistinguishable elites. But let's be specific about the particular reasons why Cameron might have been brought back. What did Cameron oversee? Well, he oversaw gay marriage. This might seem a small thing, but actually is quite indicative of post-war liberal social liberalisation. The civil service are known to be very strong supporters of David Cameron. Many of them are Cameroons or Cameronites or whatever you want to say. David Cameron also was part of the coalition with the Liberal Democrat Party, which oversaw the introduction of student fees. Many of us protested against this horrific turn, and everything we said would happen happened. The centralisation, the bureaucratisation, anxiety in students over their financial and future existence, and the basically destruction of all thought in higher education, which we've seen play out in terms of both as institutions and also in the ideology that they promote. David Cameron also oversaw the big society idea, which was basically a hugely disingenuous ploy to close public services like libraries by pretending that volunteers could run them, and then making people feel guilty when they didn't have time or money or energy to do these things. He is at this point, however, indistinguishable from Starmer, who is the other centrist politician running for the Labour Party, who is something like a sort of robot. I mean, they all are, really. It's a desperate bid for the Tories to compete with Starmer because after 14 years, they face electoral defeat on a massive scale, as indicated by the local elections so far. And it's a sort of, it's like a kind of cheap TV ploy to bring back a character that everyone remembers from season 1 or 2. It's sort of frankly embarrassing. Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary, resigned yesterday with a letter that was very excoriating against Rishi Sunak, who is a very weak Prime Minister, who was unelected, who is basically a kind of city representative. You'll remember that Britain had a sort of brief period of having a variety of leaders, some of whom lasted a few days. Boris Johnson obviously collapsed in a pile of his own fluffy-haired corruption, as they usually do. We have an elite that is both incompetent, greedy, and seemingly interminable. We can never get rid of them. Braverman has just lost the idea that we would take illegal migrants to Rwanda, has just collapsed that policy in the Supreme Court. But I think in general, we're just looking at a kind of disintegration of British rule. My slightly manic optimistic hope is that the people rise up and campaign for the common good and for a new reality, new modes of redistribution, for a return to sovereignty post-Brexit, a re-enchantment of Britain, and a recognition that the It's the working people who keep the country going, and not these deranged elites who in any case can't even keep their cars clean in the case of Boris Johnson. But we will see. It might be an interesting Christmas for everyone.
Remind us, when is the next election due to occur?
I don't know if they've called the date. It will have to be no later than 28th of January 2025. That's the latest. So, but 5 years after will be December next year. But depending on how things go, they may have to call a general election. So people are currently turning in letters of indicating their lack of support for Rishi Sunak, which is not a good sign. Right, this he's just reshuffled the cabinet. Obviously, Braverman is publicly exposing the incapacity of the Tories to actually fulfil any of their promises in 14 years. You know, I was just joking on Twitter, they didn't even abolish the TV license. You know, women especially go to prison for not paying their TV license. The Tories have long said that they would abolish it. The BBC is just the most awful thing now. Embarrassment, just puts out like absolute drivel. And the fact that people go to prison for not paying their TV license is just one of these horrific dimensions of British life. So I think, we will probably have to have a general election as soon as possible.
I remember when I was a student in the UK, I at one point was sort of provided a safe house for illegal TV, an unlicensed TV. And we sort of had to be worried about you know what it was? I had a roommate who paid for the TV license for a TV in his room. And so as a result, my other friend could stash his TV there. And I guess it would somehow be undetected, by these sinister vans that go around and sort of, are able to detect the presence of illicit TVs. Anyway.
I mean, it's literally like you can go to prison for not paying to watch state propaganda. This is insane. What country does this? The other aspect I should just quickly mention is the fact that Labour frontbenchers who voted for the Gaza ceasefire, because obviously Britain oppose the ceasefire, are going to be sacked as well, right? So the Labour Party, Labour and the Tories are both in complete catastrophic freefall turmoil. This is the situation.
And meanwhile, the Times reported that the son of a prominent literary critic led a mob against prominent conservative politician Michael Gove. Can you confirm or deny this?
I don't doubt it for a second. I mean, let's not get into specifics, but I've been around long enough to know exactly how this works. I mean, as I was saying on Twitter, much to the annoyance of some people, this is intra-elite class struggle. These are people who've gone to the same private schools, the same Oxford colleges, pretending to oppose each other in public, cosplaying as socialists and actually cosplaying as conservatives, because true conservatism has never been tried in Britain either. What we have is just this kind of increasingly inept and pathetic elite who really hate everybody else in the country, or don't even really understand that they exist, or if they do, they're kind of deplorable. And so this play acting, this acting out of people who are really the most privileged people pretending to fight each other is, that's Britain for you. And I think it's G.K. Chesterton who best captures it. I don't know if you've read The Man Who Would Be Thursday. This is, I think, the best possible, satirical, but extremely accurate fantasy, but reality of how the British ruling class work in terms of its absolute relation to itself while pretending to be divided.
Well, it's also an early novel about feds and Fed posting. As a spoiler, cover your ears if you haven't read it, but it involves the equivalence of somebody sort of being in an edgy group chat and then discovering that everyone else, as a spy, right? And then discovering that everyone else in the group chat is also a spy. This is an anarchist cell in London 100 years ago, but same basic idea. Saurabh, I don't know if you like me, once lived in the UK. Do you have any comments to add on the situation over there?
I want to mention another piece that we ran this week. We're recording this on Wednesday. This has been a very UK heavy week at Compact. So we ran the piece by Peter Hitchens lamenting the return of Lord Cameron. He's now been ennobled as Lord Cameron. But we also ran a piece by the Marxist scholar James A. Smith, one of the co-hosts of the beloved Popular Show podcast. that is critical of Sir Keir Starmer from the left, describing him as the world's most typical politician. And I just encourage everyone to read this piece, because I think he's absolutely right that we're in a post-populist moment, that the kind of center left and center right are resurgent and on a kind of vengeful path against the populisms of their own side. So in a way, the return of Cameron is a smack in the chops, as Peter Hitchens wrote in our pages, kind of the Brexiteer right. And likewise on the left, Starmer is a smack in the chops of the Corbynite Labour faction, as Smith says, and someone who definitely, like as chief prosecutor in Britain, was very much all about going after left-wing protesters, left-wing street dissent, and was very instrumental behind the scenes. I mean, James Smith doesn't mention this as much in his piece, but he was very instrumental in the Labour sort of neoliberal machine, as he calls it, that runs Labour Party, in their efforts to sideline Corbyn and the Corbynites. So it's really interesting. I mean, I think I'm very proud of our pages for featuring these two pieces side by side, because I think they both describe the same phenomenon, just on two different sides of the aisle, of kind of the center establishment coming back with a vengeance. And I see them as parallel phenomena. Like, in so many ways, Keir Starmer is a figure of the sort of new Labour, of a kind of Blairite figure. But as Smith concedes, he has more of a kind of economically left message, certainly than Blair did, but still, like, in the tone of politics, in the kind of the type of public figure that he is, it's like a return of the Labour establishment. And likewise, obviously, now, Lord Cameron is a figure of the old pre-Brexit Tory party. Interesting that they're both coming back. And what that means for people who are interested, broadly speaking, in populist change, whether they're on the left or the right, like how they can contend with this, or how they should contend with their own failure, the fact that they weren't able to overcome, ultimately, these establishments on both sides.
So turning to the American context, where it's something of a mixed scenario, I think there's certainly a sort of clear post-populist dimension of where we currently are. What we've had the return of is not just the sort of centrist establishment in various ways, but also of, I'd say, a kind of pre-populist right, which still has a significant presence in Congress. I would say pre-populist insofar as we can remember these showdowns in Congress going back to the Obama administration over budgets, government shutdowns, debt ceiling crises. In some ways, the Trump election, it's worth noting, there's sort of a long history of conservatives in the U.S. being very concerned about deficits, but then once they're actually in power, sort of forgetting that they're concerned about that. And so that's a familiar phenomenon. But as far as the past 10 years go, it did seem that, Trump's ascendancy in the Republican Party, in some ways prompted a break with this kind of penny pinching, kind of austerity focused version of the Republican Party, insofar as he, promised sort of not to cut entitlements, which is what right flank of the Republicans have been trying to force Obama to do in various ways during his presidency. And so, you have Trump coming in and saying, we're not going to cut entitlements, and, basically promising a more generous state. And then, his own administration is sort of contradictory in this regard. He brings in people like, Mick Mulvaney, who's kind of, comes out of this sort of austerity faction of the GOP in Congress. But nonetheless, he sort of seems to distance himself overall from conservatism. But, now what you've had in Congress is, Kevin McCarthy ousted, and this new Speaker Mike Johnson brought in after, various failures to elevate other candidates for Speaker. Most recently, he's avoided a shutdown before Thanksgiving by passing a kind of stopgap budget measure. Having previously been a kind of hardliner in this sort of austerity faction, he's, essentially relented and been willing to pass a measure largely on the basis of Democratic votes. And this, of course, is the same thing that's doomed many previous Republican speakers. Curious, Saurabh, what your sense is. I mean, I guess my take on it is it's another kind of zombie ideology, which is this, right-wing faction of the congressional Republicans, which, seems essentially identical in most of its priorities to the pre-populist GOP sort of conservative faction, although, perhaps it's more open to cutting military spending and kind of more isolationist in some, at least some segments of it. But overall, it seems to me that it's another kind of zombie revenant where we're back to these kind of periodic budget showdowns that, just kind of kick the can down the road. It's all very familiar from the Obama administration, as if the sort of Trump reset never happened. Curious what your thoughts are, Saurabh.
I totally agree with that characterization. The interesting thing is that we are back to like circa 2011 with a figure like Mike Johnson, and yet he's seen as more compromising on budget issues, right? He's proposed a deal now that whatever two-step funding, and the details of how that would work is so Byzantine that who cares? But the point is that the pre-Trumpian figure is more realistic about government, and the supposedly kind of populist Trumpian figures, as you say, are kind of the true inheritors of 2011 Tea Party type mentalities of with Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, saying that he wants to cut the administrative state by using the social security codes of federal employees, and depending on which numbers the last 4 digits of their social security codes end in, they would be laid off. And I mean, that's it's such a moronic idea. Like, if you think about it, it's like, oh, well, person whose number ended in 1688 happens to be a really important administrator scientist in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Like, oops, but that's how we're laying people off. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to say beyond saying your point is so well observed that the kind of post-Trump so-called populists are back to 2011, back to the Tea Party, back to the idea that government as such is suspect and should be sort of periodically threatened with shutdowns in order to get what? The 2011 Republicans never got anything out of those shutdown threats except looking foolish in the eyes of the sort of middle of the road voter. What are we going to get out of this version of it? And I just feel like Trump himself has been pretty, I think he's a figure who wants government to work and he wants government to run. And so I appreciate the disdain in which he holds some of these figures, even though some of them consider themselves his inheritors. But yeah, it's a really well observed point.
Yeah, I mean, I would point people back to Michael Cuenco's After Populism, where he, there was never really a consistent move beyond this, again, sort of austerity-driven conservatism of an earlier age. And that, essentially, if you look at somebody like Vivek, who's seen among the candidates as the one who's most clearly attempting to sort of ape Trump and be the kind of the sort of successor of Trump. I mean, I'm just reminded of various hilarious moments, Rick Perry, forgotten GOP presidential candidate, who sort of, at some debate said he was going to abolish 3 federal agencies, but then he could only remember 2 of them. This extremely unserious slash and burn approach to government that, that in practice never really seems to lead anywhere. It's almost purely rhetorical. And yet it does generate this kind of permanent dysfunction.
Right. It doesn't actually achieve a reduction in the size of government, but it just makes it it contributes to general dysfunction, as you say. And of course, another would-be populist, another sort of Trump imitator, namely Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, was asked on Fox News not too long ago, whether he would shutter government departments. And he, of course, had a long list of them. And unlike Rick Perry, Ron DeSantis seemed to remember which ones he wants to shut down, including the Internal Revenue Service, which tax collection really goes back to the founding. It's not some leftist invention, relatively recent invention. It's a pretty core function of government is to raise taxes. I don't know if we've talked about this on this podcast, but my favorite aspect of Rick Perry's inability to remember which government departments he would shut down is, which you can find the footage of this on YouTube, is that as he's struggling to remember, he's like a schoolboy being quizzed by his teacher, which government departments would you shut down? And he's like hemming and hawing and sort of shifting on his feet uncomfortably. But behind him stands the kind of libertarian stalwart Ron Paul, father of current Senator Rand Paul. And Ron Paul is holding up his whole hand and he's going, no, it's 5 departments you need to shut down, in his kind of weird voice, And I guess what's funny about that is, like, imagine being the school kid who can't remember the 3 things he needs to remember. And then you have the smarter kid in the back being like, no, it's 5. It's just one of the funniest, saddest moment in recent Republican politics. I always love that.
And that, you bring up the IRS. I mean, I think that point is worth underlining because it is probably true that, there's a need to assess our fiscal situation in a serious way. The unseriousness of the Republicans who are saying exactly that is on display in their, not only having, in the classic kind of zombie Reaganite way, no interest in the question of how to raise more revenue, but of wanting to actually disable the means by which government revenue is raised. It's just, it's completely catastrophic. And, I remember back when there was like the Norquist, like the Grover Norquist pledge, right? That people talked about, where you were supposed to pledge that you would never do anything that would lead to a tax increase, I believe. In a sense, the tragedy of the situation is that there probably are good reasons to be somewhat concerned about the long-term budget. But, that the people who present themselves as the ones who are truly serious about it are completely unserious because, really unlike sort of fiscal conservatives practically anywhere else in the world, they refuse to even consider the possibility of raising more revenue under any circumstances ever. So it's just kind of a joke. With politics on both sides of the Atlantic dispatched, we can now turn to religion, and specifically a piece that appeared in another publication the other day under the title "Why I Am Now a Christian." The title explicitly an allusion to Bertrand Russell's "Why I Am Not a Christian," perhaps the most widely read atheist manifesto ever. I don't know, perhaps, the more recent ones by Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens are more widely read. I'm not sure, but certainly "Why I Am Not a Christian" was one that I read in high school, and many others. The author of "Why I Am Now a Christian" is speaking of the New-Atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who began her life as a Muslim. His family was from Somalia, became an outspoken atheist, and has now gone public with her conversion to Christianity. Saurabh, you have a piece on this in the American Conservative. Perhaps you could just briefly recap your assessment of Hirsi Ali's piece and the debates that it has generated.
Well, I think the first notable cultural significance of this is the fact that Ayaan Hirsi Ali was this figure of pretty rabid Muslim secularism or even atheism. Actually, before 9/11, I mean, she was born in Somalia, victim of female genital mutilation there, and an attempted sort of Islamist indoctrination, moves to the Netherlands and emerges as a politician, actually an activist and a politician who's a critic of the kind of failed modes of integration in across much of Europe, Western and Northern Europe, with Muslim communities that really just have not taken on Western values at all, even as if they've settled in Western societies in large numbers. And so that's the kind of figure that she was, and obviously threatened by Islamists in the Netherlands, eventually in part because of those threats, moves to the United States. And that happens to be the post 9/11 era, when there was this kind of mode of aggressive secularism directed by a handful of really influential intellectuals, mainly but not exclusively British intellectuals, and directed at the Muslim world. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Actually, maybe now that I list those names, maybe it wasn't correct. The one who is, I think, the most, to my mind, was most interesting was Christopher Hitchens, and he's the Brit. So that's why I thought of them as a mainly British cohort. Ayaan Hirsi Ali became part of this milieu of the New-Atheists. For them, she was the sort of ideal Muslim in the sense that she wasn't a Muslim at all and was a severe critic of Islam. And so she portended the kind of societies that they hoped to bring about through the post 9/11 wars in the Middle East. And, I mean, her Hitch style dogmatism was so uncompromising that Ian Buruma in the New York Review of Books called her an Enlightenment fundamentalist, which I actually think is a pretty fair description. And that in turn inspired a whole book by Paul Berman called Flight of the Intellectuals, blaming secular liberals like Ian Buruma for not being assertive enough in defense of Muslim secularists like Ayaan. Now, these are kind of forgotten intellectual histories of the first decade of the 21st century, which I find really fascinating. So for her, this figure of like this champion of secularism to now turn to faith is in itself very significant. But the reaction among not all, but some Christians was that, they basically skewered her, because in her published statement about why she had become a Christian, she doesn't really talk about a kind of personal encounter with the God-man Jesus Christ or any of the sort of truth claims of Christianity, which are difficult to grapple with, like the Trinity or the resurrection or anything, or the incarnation of God, etc. All she talks about is the idea of Christianity as a civilizational force that, notwithstanding how attenuated the connection between today's Western societies has become from kind of their Christian roots, nevertheless, Western society in its humaneness bears a kind of Christian stamp or mark. And that's why she values Christianity and now calls herself a Christian. And so, yeah, I mean, I took issue and sort of came to the defense of Ayaan's idea of becoming a Christian, because I think actually for most of Christian history, the faith has spread civilizationally. This obsession with seeking out authentic individual belief is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. St. Augustine famously welcomed it when various Roman potentates would convert to Christianity, knowing that many of them were doing so for reasons of prestige and political prestige. He nevertheless welcomed it. The Augustinian model is like, let everyone be caught in the church's net, and then we'll let the angels sift the sincere from the insincere. It's not the job of the ordinary Christian public to be like, why are you getting baptized? It was enough that you got baptized. And so I think it's perfectly fine to make a case for converting to Christianity for civilizational reasons. I think it's more kind of liberal and Protestant to be like, but what do you really believe in your interior? That's a really recent phenomenon. When Christianity became the legal religion and then the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Christian share of the population spiked from like 10% to 90%. I mean, people have different numbers for this, and very provocatively, this 1960s French cardinal named Jean Danielou asked, did every one of those people who become Christian really understand every article of the creed, of the Apostles' Creed? And the answer was no, hardly. In fact, for many of them, Christianity was just a set of external rituals and civilizational markers. But nevertheless, it was a positive thing that more people were converting to the faith. So I think in the kind of long Augustinian view, I welcome Ayaan's civilizational case for becoming Christian.
Yeah, I really agreed with Sorab's take on this. And I saw various people kind of, usually atheists actually, saying, oh, but maybe she doesn't really believe. I mean, there's also the case that she may well have had like some personal conversion event that she just doesn't want to discuss publicly, and that's also fine. I think it's actually very interesting to see, I would say, an increasingly perhaps post-liberal turn back to the religious. Daniel Dennett was the other New-Atheist, actually, more on the philosophy side. But the other person who comes to mind more recently is Charles Murray, who's also said that he thinks that religious insights, he says, religion is indispensable to a moral civilization. What is important about religion is its sort of great insights and its traditions, which is again, a sort of turn away from the kind of hardline New-Atheist, science will solve everything. There's a huge separation between religion and science and all of that. So I think we've passed that moment into something much more interesting, much more anthropological, which is to say perhaps a recognition of the fact that human beings are fundamentally and kind of inextricably religious, and then we can have a discussion about what that actually means. But I do think, I do agree with Saurabh that the civilizational argument is a absolutely important aspect of this. And I would say there are many people, for example, like the great historians like Tom Holland we have, who are not kind of officially Christian, but who are basically de facto Christian in the sense that they celebrate Christian civilization, and their interests lie precisely in this recognition of what the West is in relation to these beliefs and in their variety. So I thought it was a very interesting piece, very interesting moment. And it's like with the Dime Square thing. I don't know if you remember. I mean, it was Matthew's wife, Julia, wrote a piece, I think, for the New York Times, defending, as someone who's like a cradle Catholic, defending the sort of recent turn to Catholicism amongst people in New York, or in a particular crowd. And of course, one could be cynical about that, but actually there really isn't the point. There's, if people are going to church and if people are thinking about a world that is not simply reducible to the political, the therapeutic and the bureaucratic, but rather thinking about, their souls and what it means to behave well and to, I don't know, to be committed to something higher. It doesn't really matter how they got there. Like, I really think this is true. Most people are functionally liberal in the sense that they're brought up in a secular world, and this is not anyone's fault. Like, it's lucky if you're brought up in a religious family, in many ways, but most people are not, right? Like, I certainly wasn't. And I think, so for people to turn to religion is, I would say, always a positive thing, no matter how they get there.
And with that, we will call it a day. Thanks to Rob. Thanks, Nina. This has been the weekly Compact podcast. Please, if you have not, go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Subscribe to Compact for access to Peter Hitchens' piece on the return of David Cameron, as well as various other articles behind the paywall this week, and all of our past and future content. Thanks again. And if you like what we're doing, please give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform.